Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. It's 4:05, but we'll go for about 45 minutes at least today. Remember, it's 11:05 p.m. here in Israel. I'm in Jerusalem right now, obviously not in the similar or familiar surroundings we would usually be in for the Watchman newscast or live streams. I am in an undisclosed location in Jerusalem. So you're not going to have the best scenery behind me right now where I am. Now, if I was outside here in Jerusalem, then you'd have the scenery, that epic Temple Mount shot that I usually have behind me on the Watchman and on TBN. But hey, we're coming to you from God's city, no doubt. It doesn't matter where we are in this city. You know it's going to be special. So we had to come to you for a live stream, even though it has been an extremely long day. I was up around 5 a.m. Abu Dhabi time, traveled from Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, earlier today to Jerusalem. And here I am. It's been a whirlwind. As you know, if you've been following the newscast over the past few days, this has been basically an Abraham Accords tour. We were in Bahrain we started in Israel. I started in Israel at least, and we went to Bahrain. We spent some time in the UAE, and now we are back in Israel to round out this trip. Now, I am part of the first ever Christian media and business leader delegation to travel to Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, led by my good friend Joel Rosenberg, of course, best-selling author. You've seen him here many times on the Watchman, editor-in-chief of All Israel News and All Arab News, and a dear friend. Joel, this is the seventh delegation that he's led to Sunni Arab countries. He's also led delegations to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. And this was quite an opportunity, folks, to get an inside look and the inside story on what has happened with the Abraham Accords since they were signed in September 2020. So I was honored to be a part of this delegation. My good friend Chris Mitchell, Jerusalem Bureau Chief for CBN News, also part of this delegation. Dan Cohen, Jerusalem Bureau Chief and Correspondent for Newsmax TV. So a great group, and also a number of great business leaders. And we met with high-level officials in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. We're also going to meet with high-level officials in Israel over the next few days before I head back to the States. More on that. But up first, we've got some breaking news we want to get into. I want to give you a backdrop, at least a little bit, on what I've been up to and why I'm here in an undisclosed location, I'll just say, and obviously not the most fantastic scenery with a curtain behind me, but we will make it work because you're not here for the bells and whistles. You are here for the content. Let's see who we have here, by the way. As we kick into it here, we've got, as always, people from all over the world here. I see South Africa. I see Brazil right off the bat. I see Canada right off the bat. I see Quebec. Okay, we are off and running here. I see Germany. Wow. Only God could assemble this group of watchmen and women on the wall for such a time as this. I see Nevada. What is the breaking news? Have you been following? We have the special forces here on the Watchman Newscast live streams. Israel carried out some major strikes. I'm not going to say airstrikes because that's not what they were. Major strikes in Syria last night. That would be Tuesday, April 26th, near the Syrian capital of Damascus. Obviously, when we were talking Damascus here on the Watchman, we are talking Isaiah 17. We're talking prophetic implications. So let me give you some of the details for what exactly happened last night. And I will just read it directly from, let's go right to the source, Al Jazeera. Let's see what Al Jazeera is saying about it. And I'm gonna go to Al Jazeera because this was a topic of conversation the past few days in Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates. The leaders in those countries, folks, just so you know, it's not just Westerners that don't like Al Jazeera. It's leaders in Sunni Arab countries who don't like Al Jazeera and their pro-Iran, pro-Muslim Brotherhood coverage. So let's see what Al Jazeera is saying, just for the fun of it. Israeli air raids near Syria's capital, Damascus, have killed 9 combatants, among them 5 Syrian soldiers, in the deadliest such raid since the start of 2022. Now, these were apparently surface-to-surface missiles that Israel used, and they were launched, according to Syria, at least Syrian government sources, they were launched from northern Israel. Surface to surface, interesting. Now, many times, of course, Israel uses fighter jets. The Israeli Air Force goes into action in Syria to strike against the Iranian regime there. And we're not sure what exactly was targeted. I'm sure in those strikes near Damascus last night, I'm sure they were weapons depots, perhaps weapons shipments coming from Iran, perhaps precision-guided missiles, perhaps drones that were en route to Lebanon and into the hands of Hezbollah in Lebanon, or to the Golan Heights area up against Israel's border. Israel once again took preemptive action and took out some kind of Iranian munitions and weapons around Damascus. And this was the third such strike in the past 2 weeks alone carried out by Israel. Now, we've got a lot of things to unpack here. You could say on one hand, look, Israel has carried out hundreds of airstrikes and even some surface-to-surface missile strikes, certainly, against Syria over the past several years. And you would be right. We've documented many, many of them here on the Watchman. But we're in a different place now, folks, for a few reasons. And the main reason is the Russia factor, which brings us to reason number two, the prophetic factor. It's ramping up because of the Russia factor. We're thinking Isaiah 17. We're thinking Ezekiel 38 and 39, and how Russia right now clearly on the march in Ukraine, and clearly with an increasingly tense relationship with Israel over Ukraine, which is going to have aftershocks in Syria. Now, Russia essentially controls the skies over Syria right now. Make no mistake about it. And as we've discussed many times here in the newscast, if Russia says no more airstrikes Israel, then Israel essentially has its hands tied for the most part. They don't want to get into a head-to-head kind of air battle with Russia in Syria, over Syrian skies. Israel wants to avoid that. And that's why you've seen Israel play a very interesting role, or strike a very delicate balance, I should say, in the war between Russia and Ukraine over these past few months. Israel has even been called on by Ukrainian President Zelensky to be a mediator. Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, who I just came from seeing, by the way, more on that in a second, from the Holocaust Remembrance event here in Jerusalem where he spoke. Bennett has traveled to Moscow. He's met with Putin face to face. He's been in constant contact with Zelensky. There's even been talk of Jerusalem hosting peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. Israel is one of the rare countries that has maintained good ties with both Russia and Ukraine, which puts Israel in a unique position. On the flip side of that, Israel has had to be very careful in the way they've approached the Russia-Ukraine war. Naftali Bennett, at least the prime minister, has been very careful not to directly slam and criticize Russia. But Israel's foreign ministry, on the other hand, has taken a much different approach. Yair Lapid, the foreign minister, has been very vocal in his criticism of Russia, Russian human rights abuses in Ukraine during this war. Russia doesn't like that. And as we've unpacked here in the newscast recently, Russia now is starting to increase its criticism of Israel over the Palestinian issue. So that's how the game's going to be played here, folks. As Israel criticizes Russia over Ukraine, Russia's going to criticize Israel over the Palestinians and over the Golan Heights. Remember, we talked about it a few weeks ago. Russia's deputy ambassador to the UN, on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in late February, said that Russia does not recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. He believes the Golan belongs to Syria and Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who, of course, is a very good friend of Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime, just as his father was with the Soviets. Folks, that is a big deal. The Golan Heights is sovereign Israeli territory. And guess what? It was part of Israel over 2,000 years ago. When you walk through the Golan, as I have, and you travel through that beautiful mountainous strategic region, you will find the remains of at least 30 ancient Jewish synagogues in the Golan Heights dating back to the time of Jesus. So needless to say, Israel has a pretty good claim to the Golan Heights. Not only that, they reclaimed the Golan in 1967 in a defensive war, the Six-Day War, against Syria and Egypt. So we have a situation where this is sovereign Israeli territory, number one. And number two, we have a situation where Israel took it rightfully in a war in which it was attacked. And number three, there's no way Israel can give this territory up because it is the strategic high ground, folks. Whoever possesses the Golan Heights is overlooking the Galilee. And Syria, like they did before the 6-day war, could move rockets in there, missiles in there. So could terror groups. Hey, that's what Iran and Hezbollah have been pushing for all along, right? They want to establish that beachhead along the Israel-Syria border, in which they can launch attacks, from which they can launch attacks against Israel. By the way, we've got thousands of people with us right now from around the world, so this is great. Welcome, everyone. Shalom from Jerusalem. You might say, wow, where is he? He's got a curtain behind him. I'm in an undisclosed location right now in Jerusalem. So sorry that it's not the usual scenic Watchman set, but you're here for the content. And the content today is these missile strikes against Iranian-linked, perhaps weapons depots, drones. We're not quite sure. But what we do know is these strikes last night occurred around the Syrian capital of Damascus. Now, the surface-to-surface issue is interesting here, I think. Again, as I said near the top, and if you missed anything at the top, you can check it out here. We'll post this afterwards. You can watch the entire newscast. And if you have questions, we're going to answer them at the end. So stick around for the Q&A, which is coming up. Surface-to-surface. Why surface-to-surface missiles? Well, I'm not a military expert or strategist. So on one hand, it could just simply have been the best possible course of action for this particular strike. Israeli planners and military heads might have seen this and said, let's use the surface-to-surface option. On the other hand, is there perhaps an increase in hesitancy to employ fighter jets over Syrian skies because of those increasing tensions with Russia? Now, maybe Israel's saying, do we want to put our fighter jets in Syrian skies when Russia controls those skies? Do we want to risk that? Because things are getting a bit tense between Israel and Russia. I wouldn't call them hostile. This hasn't broken into open hostilities, but there is an undercurrent, a very uncomfortable undercurrent that we've been tracking here in the Watchman Newscast since the summer. Back then, a Russian general criticized, let's recount real quick, folks, to see where this is heading and to see why I think one day Russia will lead that Gog-Magog invasion force against Israel. I don't know if Vladimir Putin's going to be the guy at the helm. He might not be president in a few years. Who knows what the ramifications will be if Ukraine does not go well. On the other hand, he could tighten his iron grip on control over Russia through this. We don't know, but it seems like a pretty good probability that Russia will head up that force. I know we've got all different views here on who will be involved in that Gog-Magog war that the prophet Ezekiel lays out in the books of Ezekiel 38 and 39. But the tension really started to ramp up in July with some criticism from Russian military officials over Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Secondly, fast forward, we had the Bennett-Putin meeting, the initial one in October in Russia. Everything seemed rosy, and the Deconfliction Mechanism, that's what they call it, Russian and Israeli officials, where Israel basically says to Russia, look, we're going in, we're going to carry out airstrikes against Iranian assets in Syria, and Russia looks the other way. Russia has not stood in Israel's way ever since Russia has entered Syria in September 2015. And believe me, folks, in their view, they're there to stay. Ever since, they have never stood in Israel's way, as Israel has conducted hundreds, if not thousands at this point, of airstrikes against Iranian, Hezbollah, and Syrian army assets. And remember, these are Russia's very good friends, the Iranian regime, Hezbollah, and the Assad regime. If you think Russia and Israel that relationship is going to be smooth sailing going forward, this deconfliction strategy, folks, I have to inform you, and you have common sense if you're watching this, most likely. So you can probably figure this out. This ain't going to last forever. And we have a situation where Russia now needs allies more than ever. Clearly, Vladimir Putin and Russia have been isolated on the world stage because of the Ukraine invasion. He looks out in the world landscape. Who does he have by his side? He's got China, he's got Belarus, he's got North Korea. Slim pickings other than that. So the Russian relationship with Iran, with the Assad regime, and even with Hezbollah, even with Hamas. Russian officials spoke to Hamas officials over the past week. Those relationships suddenly become much more important to Russia. And Russia says, who are our friends? Who can we really count on? Who has stood by our side during the Ukraine affair? And certainly Iran and Assad have stood by his side during this whole affair. So all of a sudden, that relationship and building on that relationship and maintaining that relationship becomes even more important for Russia. By the way, we have, according to various reports, thousands of mercenaries from Syria who are at least planning to go to Ukraine and join Russia in the fight against Ukraine. So there is a real synergy here. And we had reports, and we shared them on the newscast recently, of Iranian-backed Iraqi Shia militias shipping weapons to Russia from the Middle East. So there is a real synergy, a real relationship there. And these entities are very important to Russia now more than ever. Before, clearly, and Iran, Syria, these are the junior partners in the relationship, and they still are. But Russia right now is having a tough time in Ukraine. They're losing friends left and right, or not that it was ever friendships in Europe and in some other quarters, but at least economic interests, which we'll talk about in a minute, with the gas being shut off to Bulgaria and Poland by Vladimir Putin. Breaking news today. But Russia needs these nations now in a way that perhaps it didn't before. So it wants to strengthen that relationship with Iran. All that to say, as these close Russian allies are getting hit again and again by Israel, and wow, being weakened, and they have egg on their face. That's no other way I can put it. They've got egg on Iran, Syria, Hezbollah. They've been embarrassed by Israel time and time again in Syria. After a while, don't you think that there's a very good chance that the likes of Iran could go to Vladimir Putin and Russia and say, hey, we're getting our tails kicked here in Syria by the Israelis. You're supposed to be our friends. You control the skies over Syria. We're helping you, at least Syria. It seems that some Syrian militias or mercenaries are going to help, or maybe already are, in Ukraine. Putin welcomed them in a public statement. He said, yeah, bring them on. Isn't that cause for you, Vladimir Putin, to help us? You're letting us, again, get our tails kicked by the Israelis. When are you going to step up and tell Israel no more? How could you just sit by and watch this happen? I would argue that it's a good chance that Iran has already had that conversation with Vladimir Putin, or at least Russian officials and military officials, even before the Ukraine invasion, long before the Ukraine invasion. Iran's probably saying, hey, don't let Israel do this. But Russia has maintained, for a variety of reasons, has maintained the deconfliction strategy and allowed Israel to operate freely. Could that be about to change? For the reasons, number one, I just laid out, Russia wants to strengthen those relationships with its Middle East allies. And number two, Israel and its posture towards Ukraine. As I mentioned at the top, Israel has gone to great lengths to not offend Vladimir Putin over the Ukraine invasion. But starting in July, months before the Ukraine invasion, Russian military officials, Russian diplomats have all criticized Israeli strikes in Syria. We had the Russian ambassador to Syria just a few weeks ago saying that Israel is trying to intentionally provoke Russia with these Syria strikes. So as much as the deconfliction strategy continues, folks, there is a discontent bubbling among Russian officials, I believe. They're getting increasingly agitated with Israeli actions in Syria, and they're getting agitated with criticism from the Israeli Foreign Ministry towards Russia's various massacres in Ukraine and slaughtering civilians in Ukraine. And now Russia is starting to clap back, so to speak, with a variety of public statements. Number one, about Israeli airstrikes in Syria. Number two, about the Golan. And number three, and you're going to hear more and more of this, and this is why Russia did a call with Hamas officials last week. You're going to hear about the Palestinian issue, the Jerusalem issue, the Temple Mount issue, all the unrest there. And you're going to hear about dividing Jerusalem. This is the kind of talk you're going to hear from the Russian regime. This is how they're going to get back at Israel, so to speak. Israel criticizes us. Okay, well, you know what? We're going to make life difficult for you when it comes to the Palestinian issue, including at the UN. The thing is, Russia had already been voting against Israel for years at the UN, especially when it came to the Palestinian issue. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. But this feels different because we have a dividing line right now in the world, folks, where essentially people are choosing a side. When it comes to Russia and Ukraine, it's very tough to stay neutral. And the more reports of civilian casualties emerge, the more pressure and evidence of civilian casualties emerge, the more evidence you will have, and the more pressure will be on Israel to say something and take a firm stand. Israel, and I discussed this with my friend Amir Sarfati at Behold Israel a few weeks ago. Israel is playing that, not a game, but they're striking, I should say, a very delicate balance. And, understandably, trying not to rile Vladimir Putin and have access to Syria cut off. It's a serious concern. And I've interviewed Israeli officials over the past 2 months. Now, at the beginning of the war, I interviewed some former and current Israeli officials who said, no, the deconfliction strategy is going to last. Don't worry, Russia, we have this agreement. Russia will abide by it. It's not a written agreement, but we have this understanding, and Russia's not going to stop that. They're annoyed by Iran too, and they're going to let us operate freely. We're in a much different place. That was late February. I had those conversations here in Jerusalem. Now I'm back in Jerusalem in late April. We're in a much different place. And I think everything is on the table right now. And I think Vladimir Putin is extremely unpredictable. And I believe he wants to strengthen those Middle East relationships. And he wants to flex his muscles. He's taking lumps in Ukraine. Where is he looking good right now? Where is he looking strong? He's looking strong in Syria. And again, just 1 week before he launched the invasion of Ukraine, he launched a massive naval drill in the Mediterranean off the coast of Syria. So the Middle East is strategic. It's central to his overall aim of reestablishing essentially the old Soviet empire. And you have to have that Middle East presence. And Syria was always a Russian client state. And once again, it's a Russian/Iranian client state under the son of Hafez Assad, Bashar al-Assad. So Russia has to have that Middle East presence. So what you have, I believe, is a potential collision course between Russia and Israel. I'm not saying a military collision course, not right away. A diplomatic collision course, certainly. Increased criticism, increased disagreements, very public disagreements could be coming. I think we see the seeds are being laid for that right now. And it's a very precarious position for Israel to be in. If you know the Bible and you're a prophecy watcher, like the watchers of the Watchman Newscast are, you know where this is heading. And Israel right now is going to, I believe, be put, not right now, but eventually be put into a position where Russia is really turning up the heat. And again, I'm not saying militarily. I'm saying diplomatically and perhaps with some threats and perhaps shutting those skies. And perhaps Russian fighter jets harass Israeli fighter jets. This is just a possible scenario. And it might sound crazy to some. But I think everything's on the table right now. I think Vladimir Putin is a very unpredictable man who is in a corner in some ways right now. And who knows where he will lash out next. I don't think anyone knows. I think he's perfectly sane, by the way, and evil, and has a plan and has a strategy. He knows what he's doing. When I say sane, he's not Hitler in the bunker, I don't believe, at least not yet. He knows what he's doing. This is a concerted effort. He's strategic. It's the wrong strategy. So far, it has not worked in Ukraine, but he's got goals. He's got a strategy. He knows what he wants. So I don't think, but I think Western officials and decision makers are twisting themselves in knots trying to figure out what he wants. I don't think anyone can really say right now. And we've got more talk about Russia and the nuclear factor, which I'll get into in a minute. But I want to mention something real quick. You know, Vladimir Putin is bringing in Syrian mercenaries and bringing them in to slaughter Ukrainian Christians. Very interesting. And Vladimir Putin himself and his forces right now are slaughtering his fellow Christians in Ukraine, or at least Russia's fellow Christians. Very interesting for that subset out there who likes to portray Putin as a defender of Christianity. I always just shake my head at that notion when he is bringing in Middle Eastern mercenaries to slaughter Christians, and he's aligned with China and Iran, the two greatest persecutors, perhaps, of Christianity in the world. Some defender of Christianity is Vladimir Putin, to that very interesting subset that likes to ignore those very inconvenient facts. Nonetheless, I think but I think Western leaders need to take these increased nuclear threats from Vladimir Putin and top Russian officials a bit more seriously, because there's been a good deal of nuclear saber rattling that in some quarters it's taken seriously, but in other quarters it's basically dismissed as just empty bluster by Vladimir Putin and Russian officials. Again, today, I'm going to pull it up and we'll check it out here from the Drudge Report, a headline here, that Putin is warning the West once again. He will use nuclear weapons against the West in, quote, a lightning fast strike if anyone interferes in Ukraine. Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, said yesterday that we are in, I'm paraphrasing him, but there is a serious threat of nuclear war and nuclear weapons being used. Does he mean tactical weapons in Ukraine? Does he mean nuclear weapons deployed against Europe? I don't have a spirit of fear, and I'm not saying that. I trust in the Lord God Almighty. I don't need to be fearful. I trust the Lord. But I also think it's probably wise to at least consider what they're saying and prepare accordingly. That's what I'm saying. Just so we don't get it twisted, folks. No spirit of fear here. I know what's going on, and I know evil men have evil plots. I also know that God Almighty still sits on the throne. But what I'm saying is I don't get the impression that Western officials, Europe, NATO, the US, are taking these threats seriously enough. And Putin smells weakness. He's smelled weakness in the West now for years. Afghanistan certainly didn't help matters from a US perspective, the debacle there, the disastrous withdrawal. Europe finally, on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, finally started to pool their resources and show some form of unity and some form of united front against Putin and against Russia. Too little, too late. As weak and as disjointed as the Russian military performance has been against Ukraine, he's still got that nuclear card, does Vladimir Putin. And that makes Russia a force to be reckoned with. Their conventional forces right now may be somewhat of a mess, it seems. Again, I'm not a military strategist, but judging by the reports we're getting on the ground in Ukraine and judging from military folks that I trust, it has not been let's say, a competent performance in large part by the Russian military in Ukraine. But when you have thousands of nuclear warheads, you still have a very powerful say in world affairs, and that's what Vladimir Putin has. So I think that needs to be taken more seriously than it is right now by Western officials. And I think the West needs to make clear that we also are a force to be reckoned with, and you need to consider our own capabilities as well, Mr. Putin. But we're not hearing that right now from the West. And it's a very dangerous moment. And it's a very unpredictable moment. Now, the gas factor, let's go right now again to, let's see. Drudge Report had a few pieces here that I'm going to. And I'm not a big Drudge fan, by the way, anymore. He really, I used to be a faithful Drudge Report reader. The past year or two, he's gone in a very kind of more left-wing direction, which has not been pleasant, but still good to scan for the headlines from time to time. Russia cut off natural gas to NATO members Poland and Bulgaria on Wednesday and threatened to do the same to other countries using its most essential export in what was seen as an effort to punish and divide the West over its support for Ukraine. European leaders are condemning this move as blackmail. It's a dramatic escalation in the economic war. So cutting natural gas, thankfully, it's not the winter, right? We're getting into almost May now. But Bulgaria and Poland, and they rely a great deal on Russian natural gas. He's apparently cutting that. Is this right away from what I understand here? They won't immediately put, so they're expected to end later this year, or they were expected, I'm sorry, but the cutoff is coming. This is a first volley. Poland and Bulgaria. And then does he threaten Germany? Which relies greatly and foolishly on Russian natural gas. This is what we've been warning about. Europe foolishly and in such a short-sighted manner allowed itself to become reliant on Russian natural gas. And man, now they're literally over a barrel. Some 40% of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia. And next December, Vladimir Putin could say, I'm shutting it off. And yes, would he take a financial hit? Absolutely. But perhaps China would step in the void and China would say, we'll buy it, or at least we'll buy a good chunk. Maybe other rogue regimes would step into the void and say, we'll continue to buy your gas. We'll replace Europe, or maybe not all of Europe. Maybe we can't make up, Vladimir, all of the natural gas profits you'll be losing, but we can make up a good chunk and you'll at least break even. That's a possibility. Here's the other thing that comes up when we're talking Russian natural gas and Russia shutting off natural gas and Europe needing natural gas from other sources. And I want to talk a second about Isaiah 17, Ezekiel 38, 39 as well before we go. You know what? Let's save that for the Q&A because I know we always have questions about those two coming prophetic conflicts. But where might Europe look? Israel? We've discussed that on previous newscasts, how Israel is a budding natural gas power, huge natural gas stockpiles off the Mediterranean coast near Haifa that Israel possesses. Now, there has been more and more rumblings since this war kicked off back in late February, since Russia invaded Ukraine, and since Europe said, uh-oh, maybe we shouldn't rely on Russia for natural gas. Hello? A little late, guys and gals. But now there is more talk about, okay, how will we replace Putin's gas if we stop doing business with him? Hey, Israel has a lot of natural gas. We criticize them all the time at the UN and throw them under the bus. And we say that Judea and Samaria, the biblical heartland, is not a part of Israel. But hey, we need natural gas. So now give us what we need, Israel. That's the European model. Anti-Semitism is running rampant on our continent, but Israel, give us gas. That's the model. But Israel was planning the EastMed pipeline, which would take natural gas from Israel. I believe it would make a pit stop in Egypt, then on up through Cyprus into Europe. Sounds great. Now, it wouldn't obviously have replaced all of that Russian natural gas. Israel has a lot of gas, but not that much. Russia is a natural gas complete powerhouse and an oil powerhouse. That drives their economy. That's a driving engine. But Israel could have made up some of that natural gas, and they may very well find more natural gas in the days to come. The Biden administration opposes that EastMed pipeline. Now, I'm not saying automatically, number one, that Israel could become that natural gas provider. It would take a while to build out the pipeline and get things rolling, I'm sure, but you would think that they might want to expedite the process. If you are Europe, you might say, we need natural gas and we need it fast. Let's get this EastMed pipeline working, up and running. Problem is the Biden administration opposes it for environmental reasons and also because it makes Turkey mad. Turkey is cut out of this EastMed pipeline and they want in and they don't like it. So those are the essential reasons. It's not green enough for the Biden administration. Remember, they want to get off oil and gas. And hey, in a perfect world, possibly that would happen, but we ain't there yet. And we still need fossil fuels and windmills and all that stuff. Right now, it's not enough. And that could be your goal in 100 years, 50 years, whatever. But right now, the world needs oil and natural gas. That's just the way it is. It's common sense. And we live in times where common sense is not so common, as you can tell by what we talk about every day here in the newscast. I pull my hair out half the time over the decisions made by Western leaders, or the indecision, the indecisiveness of Western leaders. But I digress. Here's something to leave you with before we go into the questions. Does Israel step up to the plate eventually, despite Biden's opposition? Do Israel and Europe get together and say, who cares what he thinks? Let's do this thing. And especially Europe, who we had Emmanuel Macron, the newly reelected French president, ignoring Joe Biden's calls this week. We even had the leaders of the UAE and Bahrain ignoring his calls back in February, March. As a proud, patriotic American, this pains me to my soul to say this, but America, under the current leadership, is losing its prestige in the eyes of the world and its reputation as the leader of the free world, as a serious, honest broker that shows moral clarity. You have Macron ignoring your calls now, and you're the president of the United States. It's not supposed to work that way, folks. So perhaps Europe says, you know what? I'm sorry you oppose this, Mr. Biden. We're going to do it anyway, because we need the natural gas. And we can't rely on Vladimir Putin anymore. How does Vladimir Putin react if this comes to fruition eventually? And I don't know, but I think it's a plausible scenario that more and more people are writing about and talking about. Say Israel steps into the breach and starts to step up and take advantage, and wisely, and supply Europe with natural gas. The same natural gas that Vladimir Putin is no longer supplying. Don't you think Vladimir Putin might be a bit unhappy about that? He might look at Israel and say, the nerve. That should be me. You basically took our gig, our golden goose, our golden egg. You took it. That was me supplying that natural gas. And now you're stepping in? That's going to cause a lot of tension, I think, and a lot of bitter feelings on the part of Vladimir Putin. He's not going to like it. If he doesn't like criticism over Ukraine, and by the way, the Israeli criticism has not been nearly as fierce as other criticism of Russia's actions, much deserved criticism of Putin's actions in Ukraine. But Russia's not having it. And again, they've been kind of clapping back diplomatically and in public statements more and more against Israel. An interesting thing to consider, an interesting factor, an interesting possibility to consider: natural gas. The prophet Ezekiel uses the phrase, a hook in the jaw that will draw Gog, this last day's leader. I believe it's the leader of Russia. It may not be this current leader, by the way. Vladimir Putin, if Ukraine is a complete debacle, he may not be long for that position as president. On the flip side, again, as I said at the top, he might tighten his grip and be president for a long, long time in Russia. We don't know. But some leader is going to come along and he's going to assemble a, quoting Ezekiel, a latter days confederation that will move against Israel on the mountains of Israel. And Iran will be an essential part of that confederation. It's called Persia in the Bible. Today it is called Iran. By the way, Iran is a Bible land. Mordecai, Esther, King Cyrus. This was ancient Iran. This was Persia. It's a Bible land. And I believe that God will pour out his spirit on that land once again. He's doing it already. We've got at least 1 million Christians in Iran who are mostly worshiping in underground churches. It's a great untold story. We've told it here in the newscast, and I told it in a 1-hour special on TBN last year that was called The Rise of the Iranian Church. If you didn't know that, get encouraged. We're talking heavy stuff right now. Nuclear, Iran, Russia. Be encouraged. Be encouraged that God Almighty, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is pouring out his spirit right now on the Middle East, in the lands where it all began. And he's doing it in Iran. And it's almost like I compare it to a situation where Pharaoh was killing babies in Egypt. and babies were being killed. And despite it, the population of the Jews in Egypt continued to explode. The more babies Pharaoh slaughtered, the more the Jews' numbers grew and grew and grew. Well, the more the Iranian regime tries to persecute believers and followers of Jesus in Iran, the more the numbers just grow. Same in China, by the way, because you can't stop the gospel. If I've learned anything in my years on this earth, it's that you can't stop the gospel. You can't stop a move of God. And man, he's moving in Iran. He's moving throughout the region. I can tell you as we wrap and we get into the questions here, being the last few days, I'm in Jerusalem right now, being in the United Arab Emirates, being in Bahrain, I saw some very encouraging things, folks. I see people who are peace-loving in these nations, who truly and are adamant. I can tell you in these meetings with officials from the UAE and Bahrain, off the record meetings, but with top officials, they are adamant about making the Abraham Accords peace agreements with Israel work. They say, this is what we're doing. We're all in. There's no going back now. To their great credit, they put their necks on the line. You don't think they did? Guess what? Bahrain, for instance, a tiny island off the coast of Saudi Arabia, just 295 square miles. That's it. That's it. It's a beautiful place, by the way. Beautiful and modern. It lies just 100 miles from Iran. It's in between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the island of Bahrain. So if you don't think they put their necks on the line by agreeing to peace with Israel and formalizing relations with Israel, normalizing relations, then you're not seeing the whole picture. The immediate response of Iran could have been missiles launched and drones launched by Iran and proxies against Bahrain. Thank God that did not happen, but certainly there was a possibility. Iran certainly done it to Saudi Arabia, to the UAE even. So Bahrain's leaders really made a courageous decision there. And there's still a persistent Iranian threat. And if you don't think Iran wants, they see Bahrain as an Iranian province. By the way, the U.S. Fifth Fleet is there. Why should you care about this tiny island in the Persian Gulf? They call it the Arabian Gulf. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, 20,000 U.S. sailors and Marines are there. 2 U.S. carriers are there patrolling the waters, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, Persian Gulf, all of it. So they took a courageous stand there, as did the UAE, which lies just a few hundred miles as well from Iran. Again, you have this growing superpower, Shia superpower, which is driving for a nuclear bomb, which has the largest ballistic missile stockpile in the Middle East and is not afraid to use it, and is not afraid to pass that technology and its massive drone arsenal off to its proxies in the region. The UAE leaders knew that. The Bahraini leaders knew that, yet they still made peace with Israel. That says something. You know what else says something? The forces that oppose the Abraham Accords. Who opposes it? Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Mahmoud Abbas, Turkey. Okay, I see where this is going. You can tell a lot about it by who opposes it. I know that the book of Revelation, and I know it's going to happen. There will be one day a 7-year peace treaty between Israel and its neighbors. And it's not going to be good. It's going to be a false peace. This, the Abraham Accords, is not that. Far from it. And I knew it before I went to the Abraham Accords nations this past week. And I know it even more now from talking to them, from looking them in the eye and talking to them face to face and hearing and seeing their vision for where this relationship with Israel is going, and hearing them talk. In the words of one Bahraini official, our number 1, number 2, and number 3 threats right now, Iran. They are. You think Israel is adamant about the Iranian threat and frustrated with the U.S. over its obsession with striking a new Iran deal? You should talk to these leaders in the Arab Gulf. They are very aware of the threat and they're furious about it, and they are preparing accordingly. Also, I saw an openness there to Christians, to followers of Jesus. We were given a warm welcome. Hey, people even asked us about the Bible. So there's curiosity there. There was a warm welcome. There was a friendliness, a warmth in these nations, folks. And I think great things are going to happen there. I think God is moving in these nations for such a time as this. He's assembling nations alongside Israel, unlikely partners, but partners nonetheless. Ancient relations, ancient cousins. And one leader in the UAE said, it's like long lost cousins getting together, and we've got a lot to catch up on. And they're lining up. On the other end, the other side, you have the goats, the sheep nations and the goat nations. You have Iran and its whole axis lining up. Fascinating times, prophetic times, and to have a front row seat this past week has been such a blessing, I will tell you, and to see what God's doing right now. What we're doing right now is questions. Now, it's nearly midnight here in Israel. I had said to Daniel, our producer, I might cut it a little shorter tonight, but once I got talking, as my wife will tell you, I kept going, and we have to do questions now, which I invite. So let's see what we have. What do we have? What do you want to ask me? Do you want to ask me about Isaiah 17? Do you want to ask me about Ezekiel 38 and 39? Do you want to ask me about the UAE, Bahrain, the Abraham Accords, more about that and where that's heading? Because one interesting nugget there is leaders in all of these nations are saying more nations are going to come on board. Now, I believe Saudi Arabia would have come on board already if President Trump was still in office. That was clearly on the agenda. That was about to happen. I'm not saying overnight, but I believe the Trump administration was getting close to bringing the Saudis on board. There was even rumblings about like Indonesia and Asian, Southeast Asian nations. There was a lot of possibilities there. Now, is the Biden administration serious about the Abraham Accords and advancing them? No, I don't think so, which is a shame. It may be up to those nations themselves and Israel now to take the ball and run with it. If there's not a strong U.S. broker there helping to bring it together like the Trump administration did and like David Friedman did, then Israel and the Abraham Accords nations might have to pick up the ball and run with it themselves. Let's get to questions. Let's see. Okay, here's Isaiah 17. When will the destruction of Damascus happen? Do you think, and someone else asked, do you think Isaiah 17 happens by the end of the year? I'm not a prophet. I'm not God Almighty. No way am I giving dates or anything like that, folks. In all seriousness, I have no idea. What I do know is this. The Word of God says, the Bible says, not Erick Stakelbeck saying, I'm just quoting from the Bible. I read what's in God's Word, and I'm one of those crazy guys who actually believes it, because every prophecy that's ever been in that book, in the Bible, has come true. Isaiah 17 says, and it brings me no joy to say this, Damascus is one of the oldest inhabited cities in the world. It's never been completely destroyed. Not even the Mongols completely razed Damascus to the ground. But the Bible is very clear that a day is coming where Damascus will be, and I'm quoting Isaiah, it will become a ruinous heap, and it will cease to be a city. When will that happen? How will that happen? We have no idea. What I will say is this. Bashar al-Assad has not shown himself to be a wise leader, and that's an understatement. Could he make a severe miscalculation? He's got a large ballistic missile stockpile, biological weapon stockpile. He's hosting Iran. He's hosting Hezbollah. He's hosting Russia. Could he, or could Iran from Damascus or from that general vicinity, could he do something very foolish to provoke an Israeli response that would not have a very good ending for Damascus? It would have to be a very serious action by Assad or some other player in Syria to provoke that. Could there even be an accident if Iran is trying to bring weapons into Syria? It seems more and more of these Israeli airstrikes and missile surface-to-surface strikes are centered around the Damascus area. We saw what happened in Lebanon in August 2020, the massive Beirut port explosion, which was clearly a big mistake and miscalculation by people who were storing those explosive materials there. We don't know. There are a number of possibilities, but I do know that that day is coming. And again, I wish it wasn't so. I've never been to Damascus. I know in its day, it was a vibrant city. Now it is a mess, obviously, as the entire country of Syria is. Assad has basically exercised control over that country once again. Obviously, without Russia and Iran, it would have never happened. But now with their help, he's the top dog there once again. But I believe there are dire days for the city of Damascus, Damascus eventually. I do. And why do I believe that? Because the word of God says it. Now, to encourage you, from Isaiah 17, we skip a chapter, we move to Isaiah 19. Just to encourage you, because this is heavy subject matter, and to remind you that God is a God of love and redemption and salvation. Isaiah 19 talks about a highway. A day is coming that a highway will flow from Assyria, in the vicinity of Syria, from ancient Assyria and northern Iraq, Syria, that region, down through Israel into Egypt, a highway where Assyria, Israel, and Egypt are friends. They're united under the Lord God. Go back and read Isaiah 19 and be encouraged. It's amazing what God has planned. Eye has not seen and ear has not heard what the Lord has for those who love him, and what he has for the nations when the nations finally acknowledge, yes, Jesus is Lord and he's the King. And this city I'm in, Jerusalem right now, this is where he will reign from, about a few blocks from where I'm sitting right now. That's exciting. It's exciting to stand on the Mount of Olives. It's exciting to look at the Golden Gate around the walls of Jerusalem. It's exciting to look at the Temple Mount and think about and meditate on what God's going to do in the days to come, which aren't that far off, and what he's going to do in Jerusalem, his city, the city where he has written his name. Folks, be encouraged. You know, we live in Bible times. You could live in any time in history, but you're alive right now. Why? Why are you here? Are you here by coincidence? Are you just passing through? We're all just passing through on our way to our eternal home, which I hope for you is heaven. But why are you here? Why are you put on this earth? What's your purpose? Have you found it yet? It's time to find it. You know, if you're a Christian, especially, if you don't know the Lord, know the Lord. Know Jesus. If you do know him, but you feel you're kind of drifting, you know, Jesus never said, until I return, you sit on the couch and you wait for me. Find where you fit in. You might not be a TV personality, a media personality. There's so many ways you can serve the kingdom and just have a fulfilled life and fulfill the destiny that God had for you before you were born, when you were in your mother's womb. Now's the time. Stop. If you're sitting around and discouraged and feeling lost, cry out to God. Get on your knees. Say, God, what do you want from me? Where do I fit? How do you want to use me? If you make yourself available to be used, if you put yourself out there and say, God, do with me what you will, he's going to use you. I can tell you from personal experience, he's going to use you. Once I did that, my entire life changed. For 32, 33 years, first 32, 33 years of my life, I fought God. I wanted to do it my way and on my timetable. And I didn't get very far. I got, you know, a few things done, but I was on the shelf. I didn't know I was on the shelf, but I was on the shelf. Once I surrendered my heart and said, I'm yours. I want to do it your way. You're a loving God. I know you want what's best for me. I trust you. Take the wheel, because I can't do this without you. Be my Lord, be my Savior. That's when my life took off in every way. And the floodgates opened. I'm not lying. And God, every day has been adventure ever since I prayed that prayer. And I encourage you to do the same thing and accept Jesus into your heart. I had to say that. I had to share that. I have a duty to share it, because I'm meeting with, you know, ambassadors all the time and interviewing people. My first and foremost duty is as an ambassador for Christ. And if I don't fulfill that duty, then I'm not fulfilling the reason I was put on this earth. Let's do another question or two before we go, because I started a few minutes late. I was coming from Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum here in Jerusalem. They had Holocaust. Okay, Daniel's telling me we've got a good question. Daniel, where did you send that question? To my phone. Okay, let's see. Here we go, folks. Let's see what we got here. One of our members from Israel, Lipaz Dotan. I've seen you on here before. Good to see you again, man. Good to hear from you, and thank you for being a member. And Lipaz is a member, and hey, if I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, by the way, my friend. But if you want to be a premium member here in the Watchman, just go to our homepage. I believe our homepage here on the YouTube channel, I believe under Join. And you can become a premium member, and you will get exclusive sneak peeks at every new Watchman shows and behind-the-scenes commentary. We've got some other good things planned as well. Lipaz asks, you talked with our officials in the past few days. Do you believe escalation in the Gaza Strip is possible in light of the upcoming Memorial and Independence Day? I would say yes, but as you know, that depends more on the Palestinians than it does Israelis. I believe Israeli officials right now are certainly, goes without saying, high alert, but there were missiles fired again from Gaza on Saturday, Sunday, over this past weekend. That depends on Hamas. And by extension, that depends on Iran. Does Iran want to stir the pot? Does the Muslim Brotherhood want to stir the pot? It depends on outside actors and what they want to do. Do they want to stir a hornet's nest? Memorial Day, Independence Day coming up in Israel, as you mentioned. Also, the one-year anniversary of last year's war between Israel and Hamas coming in a few days, that 11-day war. I think Israeli officials are highly concerned about it. And they're ready for any contingency, I would say. I hate to give kind of a cliched answer, but they are very concerned about the possibility of an escalation in Gaza. But as you know, living in Israel, that never really changes. There's always concern about an escalation in Gaza, but more so now because of the Temple Mount factor, I think, and what Hamas is trying to do there. They're trying to paint themselves as the defender of Al-Aqsa and the defenders of Jerusalem. And that's a dangerous thing because they are accusing Israel of defiling the Al-Aqsa Mosque and desecrating the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Who's desecrating this site when it's Palestinian rioters who are literally using the mosque to store weapons and launching Molotov cocktails from the mosque against Israeli soldiers and security forces and civilians, and who are playing soccer inside the mosque with their shoes on? Who's desecrating the mosque? Nonetheless, a lie the old saying, what's the lie? A lie travels halfway around the world before the truth gets there. I don't know that saying, but it's a good one. But that's what you have. And the good thing is, in talking to Arab leaders in the Gulf, they get it. They know what's really happening on the Temple Mount. They know the game. They know there's a larger game, not, I guess you could say game, but there's larger motives, larger players at work. Iran, first and foremost, and Hamas. So yeah, Gaza is a tinderbox. It's on a knife's edge right now. And certainly there is the possibility, and I hate to say it, would anyone watching right now, based on what we've seen the past 2 weeks and the past 20 years, be surprised if things broke out, if Hamas or Islamic Jihad decided to fire a volley of rockets? Something could happen on the Temple Mount tomorrow, God forbid, and Hamas will seize on it. A Jew could visit well, not right now, they can't visit Temple Mount, but a Jew could sneeze in Jerusalem and Hamas would say, they're desecrating Al-Aqsa, and start firing rockets. It's that insane, but that is where we're at right now. Hey, I got to wrap up now. It is past midnight here in Israel. We had thousands of people with us. This was awesome from Jerusalem. I'm kind of going on fumes. I hope usually I kind of pride myself on kind of flowing and not saying, If there was a few of those tonight, I apologize. I'm a bit tired. I was in the UAE this morning. Now I'm in Jerusalem, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I thank God every day for what I do and the positions he's putting me in. Who am I? I'm just a guy from Philly, from humble beginnings, and I'll never forget where I'm from and where God has taken me and what he's doing in my life. I am unworthy, and I just thank him every single day. I hope you do too, no matter what you're doing. Stay humble, folks. Stay humble. I joke around, I say, I'm just a regular dude, and I'm never going to change. And so it's a lot of fun to do this with all of you. Love you all. God bless you all. Shalom from Jerusalem. More to come here from Jerusalem tomorrow and Friday. Stay tuned. Until next time, thanks again for joining us. God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. See you soon. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.